Often in our letters, after we open the letter, in the last part of the transition, we include a proposition. A proposition puts forward, that's what pro means in the word proposition, to put forward. A proposition puts forward a position. It indicates the real purpose or reason why we wrote the letter. We might say something in our letters like, "So what I really want to tell you is how much I miss talking to you, how much I hope we get a chance to talk sometime soon. I'd love to find out more about how your new job is going and about your family." In a very real way, when we say things like that in our letters, we're not doing something different from Appian. Because Appian says something very much like that after his prayer of thanksgiving to Serapis and after his narrative. "I beseech thee, therefore, my Lord Father," he says, "write unto me a little letter, firstly of thy health, secondly of that of my brother and sister, thirdly that I may do obeisance, pay my respects to your hand, and what it tells me I should do." Paul's letters follow this pattern and include this element too. But because the purpose of Paul's letters is often more concerned with correcting or instructing, and because Paul's letters are addressed for the most part to groups of people, his propositions are more elaborate and more rhetorical. However, in the same way as Appian's letter and our letters, Paul's propositions are the key to his purposes in writing the letters. That's certainly true for 1 Corinthians. Many interpreters, including myself, believe the proposition of 1 Corinthians begins in chapter 1 and verse 10, when Paul says, "I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, that all of you agree, and that there be no dissensions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment." The need for Paul to pursue agreement and unity of mind and judgment in 1 Corinthians is evident throughout the letter. For there are clear differences of opinion about whether it's wiser to be married or stay single, whether it's wise or right to eat food dedicated to idols or not. If chapter 1 and verse 10 is indeed the proposition, though, it illustrates the fact that sometimes the proposition can precede or be intermingled with the narrative in a letter, so that the narrative helps explain circumstances that elicit the proposition. The transition in 1 Corinthians is lengthy. The narration of circumstances in chapter 1 in verses 11 through 16 leads back in a very interesting way to what is, I believe, the completion of the initial statement of the proposition that begins in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10. Paul says in that verse that he is making an appeal for agreement. He wants all the Corinthians to be of the same mind and the same judgment. But how can they agree? How can they come to a common mind on the matters that divide them? How can they read the same judgment and make the same judgment? Paul answers those questions in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verses 17 through 19. So after the initial statement in chapter 1 and verse 10, and the narrative in chapter 1 and verses 11 through 16, Paul elaborates and completes the proposition in 1 Corinthians 1, verses 17 through 19. He does so with a series of 3 sentences in Greek and in English that all begin with the conjunction for. All these sentences provide crucial definition about the meaning of the general terms that Paul uses as he states the proposition initially in 1 Corinthians 1:10. Let's take a few minutes and dig deeper to see how that works. With respect to the divisions or parties that exist in the church, Paul's words seem to point to the conclusion that each of these groups derived their identity from a claim to belong to a certain teacher they consider wiser than any other, and from a claim to have been baptized by that person. In response, Paul says, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, and not with eloquent wisdom, so that the cross of Christ might not be emptied of its power." That's 1 Corinthians 1:17. To bring about agreement, a common mind and judgment among the Corinthians, Paul knows there must be a common understanding of what's central with respect to wisdom. There must be a clarity about its locus, a source for understanding how to live life as a follower of Christ that's preeminent. And in this way, by the way, Paul's understanding of wisdom is identical in character to the understanding of wisdom in the Old Testament. As, for instance, when the book of Proverbs begins in verse 7 by saying, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." In the book of Proverbs, this is a shorthand way of saying respect for the one who rules over creation and obedience to his commands is the beginning of wisdom. For Torah was, in the Old Testament, the preeminent locus or source for wisdom. In response to the gracious covenant that Yahweh made in choosing the children of Israel, Israel was expected to maintain their relationship with and their respect for Yahweh by wisely choosing to learn and obey Yahweh's commands. To do this, to value Torah in this way, led to salvation. To fail to do it led the people of Israel to perish repeatedly in their history as Yahweh's people, as, for example, in the exile. Paul is aware of the way Torah and the commandments functioned in Israel's past and continue to function in its present as the locus and epitome of wisdom among Jews in Israel and in the diaspora. But even more importantly, Paul is aware that while the wisdom of Torah continues to be important, something else has become preeminent to living life as God's people in the Messianic age. In verse 18, he names what this is. It is the message of the cross, the message that belongs to the cross and that originates from the cross. It is the message about the meaning of the cross, the centrality of the cross, what the cross represents in terms of wisdom about how to live life with God as a follower of Jesus Christ. It is the wisdom that, if it's ignored, will lead those who ignore it to become, even now, perishing. But it is the wisdom that will lead those who believe in it to be, even now, those who are being saved. The message of the cross, Paul writes in verse 18, is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. It is this wisdom that has power to bring about salvation and keep on saving us by teaching us how to live life in relationship with God and with Christ. For Paul, the message about the cross is now the preeminent source of wisdom, the event that provides the principle to guide believers in living a life in relationship to God as their Father and Jesus as their Lord. And what is the message of the cross? It is the message about selfless agape love. Selfless agape love. Self-emptying, self-denying, self-sacrificial, selfless agape love. This is the love Jesus spoke about, this selfless love for God and for your neighbor, when a scribe asked him about the preeminent commandment, the one that was most important of all. And when the scribe heard Jesus answer that the most important command was to love God and to love neighbor, he affirmed Jesus' reply. He affirmed that selfless love for God and for neighbor was the most important commandment of all. And when Jesus heard him do that, according to Mark in chapter 12, when Jesus saw the scribe had spoken wisely, he said to the scribe, "You're not far from the kingdom of God." The message of the cross is what Jesus left with his disciples at the Last Supper, when he told them, according to John, "A new commandment I give to you. Love one another as I have loved you." And this new commandment is now Jesus' version of the great commandment, the first commandment. This kind of Christ listening, Christ honoring, Christ following, selfless agape love is what Paul will talk about and use over and over again as the touchstone for his teaching that addresses each of the issues that he addresses in 1 Corinthians. Because of that, Paul will begin the body of the letter by defining the locus of wisdom as the message of the cross. He will go on to say that this is not a wisdom that belongs to this age or the rulers of this age, for if the rulers of this age had known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Paul will tell the Corinthians that God has revealed this wisdom to them through the Spirit, that the Spirit of God will continue to mediate the mind of Christ to them if they grow up and mature, if they are willing to listen and be spiritual people, people led by God's Spirit, not by their own selfish impulses or selfish pride. And this same theme is vitally important to grasp, not only so we can interpret the meaning of 1 Corinthians for the church at Corinth, but so we can interpret the meaning of 1 Corinthians for the church today and for our lives today as Christ followers. In these lectures this week, we've talked about the opening of 1 Corinthians, the transition between the opening and the body of the letter as well. I hope I've been able to help you dig deeper into how ancient letters were written and how Paul's letters were written in a way that will provoke you to dig deeper, not only into 1 Corinthians, but each of Paul's letters. I'll see you again online soon.